computer's being slow. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 9, Section 4, and it's titled The War with Mexico. Now, as the United States annexed Texas, this was obviously upsetting to the Mexican government because the United States had offered to purchase Texas. Mexico had clearly said no. Texas rebelled and seceded from their lawful government in the Texas Revolution, and then the United States offered to annex them. Texas seceded from Mexico because Mexico tried to abolish slavery in this colony that they had invited Americans to move to on the condition that they become lawful Mexican citizens. And so when these Anglos rebelled against their government because of slavery and requested to join the United States as a slave state, when that was confirmed, that was very upsetting. In fact, that was a step towards war with Mexico. President James K. Polk, by the way, Polk County is named after this man, ran for president in 1846 with a campaign slogan, 5640 or fight. Those are lines of longitude and latitude. They refer specifically to the Oregon Territory. His campaign slogan was threatening to go to war with Great Britain if they did not give us territory. And he won and became President of the United States on a threat of war for conquest. You see, conquest, or conquering land, was not considered an evil thing at this time. And while we talk about the war with Mexico, I will bring in some of the moral and ethical problems that come with conquering land. But it was not generally considered a bad thing, not until the two world wars. Really, the two world wars taught us as a global society that conquest can lead to very terrible consequences. But at this time, let me quote a Prussian general, war is but another means of diplomacy. The real contentious political issue in our country was not conquest, not how should we treat conquered peoples, not is this the right thing to do. The real contentious issue was slavery. So James K. Polk, of course, once he was elected, favored war with Mexico. We had offered to buy Texas. They had said no. So we acquired Texas by violent means. Though it was not the United States that fought Mexico in the Texas Revolution, we were the beneficiaries. And so Polk believed that war with Mexico would gain us not only Texas, but also New Mexico and California and the southwestern United States. We could conquer Mexico and we could steal half of their country. And we believed we could get away with it. Now, meanwhile, this was Polk's strategy of how to provoke war with Mexico. He sent John Slidell, his Secretary of State, whose job it is to negotiate treaties, down to Mexico to offer to buy New Mexico. So we've seen this before, right? Because just previously we had offered to buy Texas. They had said no. Now we're offering to buy New Mexico and then negotiate the border with Texas and possibly even buy California. Can you imagine? What if Canada came to us today and said, we'd like to buy Maine, we'd like to buy Oregon, and we'd like to buy Vermont?
Good luck.
Vermont has considered seceding from the United States. Time to time it does come up. They don't feel very connected to us. Politically they identify somewhat differently, more closely with Canada. So what if Canada came and said, by the way, Vermont's been discussing joining with Canada. We'd like to go ahead and make that formal. And the United States obviously is going to say, no way, Jose. Well, then what if Canada said, by the way, this is happening, whether you want it to or not. Vermont actually kind of wants to be a part of Canada. So this is happening. And what are you going to do about it? Well, we're obviously going to do something about it. You don't just take Vermont. Just like Mexico said the same thing. The United States came down to Mexico and said, we're taking Texas. And Mexico says, no way, Jose. And we say, by the way, a number of people in Texas want to be a part of the United States. Mexico is still going to be upset. It's their territory. And so, of course, Slidell was rejected. But that was the first part of the strategy. You have to try diplomacy, otherwise you appear like a bad guy. Now, Santa Anna was disgraced. By the way, Santa Anna was the president of Mexico during the Texas Revolution. He was disgraced because of Texas's victory, and he was ousted. In fact, after the Texas Revolution, the Mexican government was becoming increasingly unstable. So meanwhile, since Slidell had been rejected, Polk sent General Zachary Taylor with the United States Armed Forces to blockade the Rio Grande, the major trading route in the Gulf of Mexico around the southern border of Texas. So he essentially sent a large army to stand right on the border of Mexico, to just stand there and to blockade the Rio Grande, the major trading port in that area. Abraham Lincoln, meanwhile, was beginning to question Polk's motives, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, Abraham Lincoln was a senator at this time. So he wasn't president of the United States. He didn't have executive authority. He was involved in passing laws in our country, and of course it is Congress that has the right to declare war. A president may send troops to a place like he did with Zachary Taylor for a time, but a formal declaration of war does come from Congress. This army, sent to blockade the Rio Grande, was meant to provoke a fight. And sure enough, a fight did break out. In fact, if you think of this as United States border and this as Mexico, there's a little town right on the border called Matamoros. Anybody ever heard of it? Okay, that was the site of the first bloodshed in the U.S. war with Mexico. Now, Matamoros is south of the border. It's in Mexico. Very clearly, look at a map. It's not debatable. There was a bar in Matamoros, and these soldiers would frequently go to that bar. That's what soldiers do. They go to bars. And what else do soldiers do in bars? Well, sometimes they get in fights. Sometimes these fights get nasty, especially if the bar would be in, quote, enemy territory. In this particular bar fight, 9 American soldiers got themselves killed. 9 American soldiers got themselves killed in a bar fight in Mexico. If you know anything about border towns, that's, sadly today these aren't the safest places in the world. But this led President Polk to go in front of Congress to pound his fist on the table, pound his fist on the podium, and shout, "American blood on American soil." And what do you think Congress did when he stood up and he shouted, "American blood on American soil"?
And asked, was it really?
Well, Lincoln asked, was it really? But I think he was the only one. His voice was drowned out.
I guess they all screamed for war.
Because let me give you a few other examples. So Polk shouted, "American blood and American soil, let's go to war." Can you think of any other times where that has happened?
Revolution.
Remember the Maine, 1888. USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in Cuba. December 7th, 1941, a day that will forever live in infamy. What was that one? Pearl Harbor, good. This day September 11th, 2001, terrorists have hijacked airliners, crashing them into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and one has crashed over Pennsylvania soil. What was that one? 9/11. And then finally, on this day, in 1964, in the Gulf of Tonkin, North Vietnamese have torpedoed an American patrol boat, killing American soldiers aboard an American ship. Anybody know that one? That was the start of the Vietnam War. Now, in all of those cases I just cited, we had soldiers stationed near or on the soil of the enemy that fired at us. In every one of those cases, we had troops in Saudi Arabia prior to 9/11. We had troops in Matamoros prior to the U.S. war with Mexico. We had troops in the Gulf of Tonkin, which, by the way, if you look at a map, is on North Vietnam's Gulf. We had troops in Havana Harbor in Cuba, which, by the way, was Spanish territory at that time. In all of those cases, the people that we wound up fighting claimed that we were provoking a conflict by stationing troops north of the border. Now, again, there's two sides to the story, right? You know, we argued, our counter-argument with Saudi Arabia, which I'll get to much later, was that these troops were there to maintain peace. Our counter-argument here was that we were to blockade the Rio Grande in response to our rejection of an offer for purchase. Our response in 1964, to keep peace. Our response in 1898, to keep peace. I could go on with almost every example of every conflict that we have been involved with in some way. Because the reason we do these essays, ladies and gentlemen, is there are many sides to a story. In fact, your U.S. war with Mexico, this very question that I'm discussing with you at great length, will be your question for the next essay. Was the U.S. war with Mexico justified? When Polk pounded his fist on the table, was he telling the truth, or was Lincoln telling the truth? You see, Representative Abraham Lincoln was perhaps the only voice here that actually questioned the legitimacy of Polk's statement. He had to be the thorn in the side and ask, can you tell me where this fight actually occurred? Was it on American soil, like you said? Because have you looked at a map of Matamoros? Well, Congress didn't look at the map either, and so the fight happened. Meanwhile, how did Americans feel about this? You see, most Americans weren't going, where's Matamoros exactly? No one really cared. I hate to say it. No one was really wondering about the ethics of provoking a war for conquest. This was commonplace. That's how Germany began, by the way. Otto von Bismarck provoked a war with France to gain territory that gave the Germans a common enemy, unifying them as a state. That was occurring around the same time as the U.S. war with Mexico. Meanwhile, the only real matter for debate in this war is whether we should allow slavery in the new territories that we conquer. I hate to say it, that was about it. No one was really scratching their heads and going, should we conquer this land? Everyone was fine with that. In fact, here is the land that we conquered from Mexico in this war. That is roughly the size of half of their country, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, if you've ever wondered why Mexico has many of the political and economic problems that they have, why many people have left Mexico to come to the United States, much of it can be traced back to this war. Generally, stealing half of a country doesn't work out well for what's left of it. I mean, think of Germany after the Second World War, where the Soviet Union conquered East Germany. Think of so many places that have been conquered and territory has been stolen. It doesn't typically turn out well. Okay, So I've already told you the story of how Polk provoked the war and the conflict in Matamoros that resulted in 9 American deaths. Congress resoundingly approved the war. Like most debates, I don't know if you watched the recent one, people aren't always watching to see who is right. Sometimes people are just watching to see who sounds the best or who is the loudest. Even though Lincoln was right, his voice was drowned out by the rest of Congress. They were all fired up about this. They were already writing country songs. And so, President Polk, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army, ordered Colonel Stephen Kearney to march down to Santa Fe. Same Santa Fe that we had been conducting with business for decades. New Mexico surrendered to the United States without a fight. And so here we see a wood engraving of Colonel Stephen Kearney capturing Santa Fe, New Mexico. You don't see any fighting in this picture because it was actually resolved peacefully. Many of the people that were ruling New Mexico at that time were white Americans that had moved down there to trade. It's not unlike the story in Hawaii. In fact, in Hawaii, by the way, we conquered the islands of Hawaii in the late 1800s because there were a number of American sugar planters that wanted to take over the islands. And so with the help of the U.S. Marines, we conquered Hawaii, and now it is a state of the Union. Same with New Mexico. And then we get to California. Remember, this is a war of conquest. And so Stephen Kearney and the U.S. Army were sent into these areas to conquer them in the name of the United States. Now, in the 1830s, there were roughly 12,000 Mexican settlers in California. By 1840, there were only 500 Americans. Now I want to tell you a different story. In 1938, Hitler claimed that there were ethnic Germans living in Czechoslovakia, and that these ethnic Germans were being abused by the ethnic Czechs living there and the Slovaks living there, and that these Germans needed freedom. They needed to be with Germany. And so he used that as his justification in the Munich conference, which will be a later essay in US 2, to invade Czechoslovakia. Now, I want to tell you the same story using different words. In 1840, there were 500 white people living in California. These 500 white people needed freedom from those 12,000 Mexican settlers that were living there. And so General Stephen Kearney and President James K. Polk used that as justification to invade California. And so with the help of General John C. Fremont, the Republic of California was created in 1846. Fremont joined with Stephen Kearney and Commodore John D. Sloat of the U.S. Navy to declare California an American territory. Now, in the war with Mexico, in fact, we were not only interested in the Southwest, we sent an invading force to capture and occupy Mexico City. Can you imagine? Mexico City is the second largest city on the planet. And so we sent an army to conquer Mexico City. And within 6 months, we had arrived. The United States was generally the victor in this war. Mexico suffered from poor leadership in their military, from an instability in their government. And the invasion of Mexico, led by General Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, again captured Mexico City within 6 months. Polk promised to help Santa Anna return to power if Santa Anna promised to surrender to the United States. And so Polk helped Santa Anna get back into power, but Santa Anna continued the fight with the United States for a short time. But in the end, the two parties reached an agreement for a conditional truce, and the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo was signed. Now, this treaty was signed in 1848. The provisions of this treaty set that Texas would have its southern border at the Rio Grande. Mexico would sell these lands to the United States for $15 million. And Mexicans living in these territories would have the same rights as any other American citizen. So if you've ever wondered why so many people speak Spanish in the southwestern region of our country, it's because many of their ancestors were there prior to 1848. Meaning they're not immigrants that have moved over. They were naturalized American citizens because their land was conquered by the United States. And so culturally, much of the Southwest still identifies as Hispanic. So the war enlarged American territory roughly by 1/3. The final acquisition was authorized in 1853. It was known as the Gadsden Purchase. Now, meanwhile, the election in 1848. Again, I want to point out a distinction here. The 2004 presidential election was all about the Iraq War. Should we continue this war? And that was from the very beginning, by the way. Or should we elect someone who will end this war? Now, in 1848, right after the war with Mexico, again, you have to understand the difference in the culture. No one was debating, should we have done this? Everyone was debating, should we allow slavery in these new territories? Now, the Democrats were divided. Southern Democrats certainly wanted slavery to extend into the territories. Northern Democrats not so much. And this allowed for the Whig nominee, Zachary Taylor, to win the election of 1848. There was no Republican Party at this time. There were Whigs and there were Democrats. And that was it. So there's the Gadsden Purchase, by the way. It's the final acquisition of the southern border. And finally, in 1848, gold was discovered in California. Now, I mentioned during the war, there were only 500 white people living in California. Most had come there to set up a naval port, to trade with Asian countries. But when gold was discovered in them there hills in 1848, people rushed to California. Blows my mind. Within a year, enough people had moved to California for discussion of statehood to begin. Guys, that's 500,000 people. So within a year, 500,000 people had moved. No, excuse me, that's not accurate. I think 200 to 250,000 people had moved within a year. And that's called the gold rush. People moving to California for gold were calling themselves 49ers because much of these people were going over in 1849, coming from all over the world for the hope of getting rich quick.
Just days before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill, and soon the California gold rush was on. By 1850, California had become populated enough to become the 31st state. 8 years after gold was found in California, it was discovered in Colorado. Within months, 100,000 people had come. Enough of them stayed to make Colorado a U.S. territory in 1861. The third gold rush was in the Klondike region of Canada, where gold was found in 1897. This brought thousands of people to the Klondike region, and many also went further west to Alaska in search of gold. Miners also played a part in the growth of Virginia City, Nevada, and in opening up South Dakota's Black Hills to settlement.
So the impact of this gold fever. San Francisco became a supply center for miners. Many of them were going into the Sierras in the northern part of the state, but they would pass through Southern California on their way and pick up supplies. And so San Francisco became an important commercial hub from the very beginning of California's statehood. Now, when California's population exceeded 100,000, that was the number I was looking for, 100,000, they applied for statehood. I mean, can you believe that? Within a year, that many people traveled all the way across the country. This is prior to the Transcontinental Railroad. That means they either walked, or they took horses, or they rode those bumpy wagons all the way, 3,000 miles, by the way. Even today, in an automobile, that's about a 48-hour drive, 2 days solid drive.
How long again?
Roughly 3,000 miles. Yep. Now, slavery was permitted in California until it was outlawed. Eventually, California will join the Union as a free state, and they will actually send some soldiers to fight in the Civil War, even considering their great distance from the southeast. But we'll talk more about California's transition towards statehood. I did want to show you a brief cartoon here about people rushing to California. There was no such thing as a flying car at that time, obviously, but the point of the cartoon is that people were going by any means necessary. This guy was willing to swim to catch a boat. They wanted to go. You see, they all have pickaxes because they want to get rich finding gold.